Oi, Isa, tá por aí já? Bom, vamos começar então? Bom, queria agradecer novamente a presença de todos para participar de mais um encontro do Tiaços, Oficina de Imaginação Compartilhada. Se eu não me engano, eu acho que esse é o nosso 9º ou 10º encontro. E hoje a gente vai ter a grande alegria de receber Mark Winborn. Mark, ele é um psicanalista junguiano que trabalha em Memphis, nos Estados Unidos. Ele é trainee da International Society of Jungian Analysts e trainee também no Instituto C.G. Jung, em Zurique. O Mark é autor desse livro, A Interpretação na Análise Junguiana, Arte e Técnica, que, a meu ver, é um livro absolutamente único e singular dentro da literatura junguiana. Quer dizer, eu acho que não há nada parecido com o trabalho que o Mark fez e acho que ele traz à tona uma questão que é uma questão muito difícil de ser pensada dentro de uma tradição da psicologia analítica. Ou seja, qual é o lugar da interpretação dentro da clínica junguiana ou, mais efetivamente, o que caracterizaria uma interpretação dentro da clínica junguiana? Como se dá o processo de criação de uma interpretação? Eu acho que, a fim de poder trazer essas questões, estabelecer uma troca, é que o Mark está aqui para compartilhar com a gente. Mark, seja muito bem-vindo. Obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite.
Thank you, Marcus. I really appreciate it and look forward to our afternoon together. Are you ready for me to begin?
Ok, sim, vamos lá.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you for inviting me. This is Interpretation and Jungian Analysis, Art and Technique. The issue of interpretation is fundamental to the process of analysis or any psychology of depth. It's the medium by which our art form is transmitted and by which transformation is constellated. If the analytic vessel is thought of as the canvas, then our interpretations are the paints with which the depth psychologist participates with the patient in the creation of the painting. What one chooses to say in analysis, why one chooses that particular thing to say, how one says it, when one says it. These are some of the building blocks of the interpretive process. It's an important tool to be used or not used, but it cannot be used if we do not develop fluency with it. The various psychoanalytic institutes have made the study of technique central to their process and have developed a highly refined model of analytic technique for which the idea of interpretation is central. Freud laid out the fundamental principles of technique in psychoanalysis in a series of 10 papers published between 1910 and 1919. And while there's been some variation around that, many of those same principles still are in effect. And they're the principles that Jung was familiar with himself and admits often utilizing. Knowledge of interpretation and the clinical phenomenon being interpreted expands our sense of the symbolic by developing a greater awareness of, appreciation for, and understanding of the symbolic aspects of the analytic interaction. Sometimes when I begin to talk about interpretation and technique, people are initially turned off by it, because on the surface that can sound dry and somehow mechanical. However, the interpretive process is where the creative aspect of analysis really comes alive, when the analyst becomes the poet, However, it takes work to become fluid in the creative process. It's like any art form. The artist, whether poet, dancer, musician, painter, sculptor, or composer, they spend thousands of hours practicing the craft of their technique. Before they can improvise fluidly, jazz musicians spend years learning scales, chord structure, modes, standard progressions, and the techniques of their particular instrument. However, my feeling is that Jungian therapists and analysts are often reluctant to practice their craft behind the basic skills of analysis other than dream interpretation, rendering their interventions more limited. So what constitutes technique? It's very simple. Beginning and terminating the analysis has a particular form and structure. How to establish and maintain the analytic framework. The interpretation of the analytic interaction, including the analysis of the transference and countertransference, which is the piece that we'll be focusing on most today. The analysis of defenses and resistance. And the interpretation of dreams, which we're all familiar with. And then finally, the termination of the analysis. Jung said, this is quoted by Jolanda Jacobi, "It is on the whole probable that we continually dream, but that consciousness makes such a noise that we do not hear it." So he's saying, essentially, we're dreaming whether we're asleep or awake. If we take this statement seriously, then everything that happens and is said in a session is meaningful, not just the concrete surface meaning of the verbalizations and behaviors, but as a kind of dreaming in need of interpretation. Or as Thomas Ogden puts it, learning to dream the analytic session. When we begin to look at contemporary neuroscience and metaphor, we begin to understand more clearly why interpretation is so important. On the screen, you'll see a set of MRIs from two different subjects. And a group led by Philip Davis at the University of Liverpool, who's a Shakespearean scholar. He wanted to understand what makes Shakespeare's work so powerful. And he recruited some people from the neuroscience department, and they had subjects read ordinary prose material like we would read in a magazine or a newspaper that's largely devoid of metaphor. And then he had subjects read passages from Shakespeare. In the top row, you'll see that the area of focus is skewed to one side and skewed towards the upper frontal lobe, which is where we do most of our conscious rational thought. And in this case, it's also skewed more to one side of the brain. Now, we've all heard about left brain and right brain people, and actually that's research that's now largely been discredited. Creative people are actually people that use both sides of the brain, both hemispheres. And what you see in the bottom row is that these people that are reading Shakespeare, the centers of activity in the brain have become much more bicameral or bihemispheric and shifted down into the midbrain, into the amygdala area of the brain where we process our emotions. So it brings the neural network alive in a much more engaged way and metaphor moves the activity of the neural network into more emotional centers away from our rational logical thought. This center line is the EKG, or I'm sorry, the electroencephalogram, the EEG of these two figures. And what you hope to see is a fairly wide band that has density at the edges. This section right here, next to 420 milliseconds, is the section of somebody reading ordinary prose. And you can see that the amplitude of the wave is not very wide, and it's not very dense at the periphery. And this 630 millisecond band is the band of the person reading Shakespeare. It becomes a wider amplitude and much more densely populated at the edges. This is the typical activity of someone doing creative work. So the way Philip Davis summarizes this process is, he says, metaphor is like the brain on a rocket booster. It lights up like a Christmas tree. So we get a confirmation of some of what Jung intuited clinically, of the importance of things like fairy tales, alchemy, religions, things like that, that are inherently metaphorical. We can look at another slide, and this is the slide, the red and yellow portions are the portions of the brain that are activated by touch, sensory touch through our fingertips, or when we see texture through our eyes. These green sections are the sections of the brain that are activated when we hear a sensory metaphor. So a simple example of that is, I had a bad day and I had a rough day. The word rough suggests a texture. When the person reading the sentences read rough, these green areas activated. They didn't activate when they read, I had a bad day. So we can see our neural network is optimized to process and respond to metaphor in a very basic, fundamental way. Now, what is metaphor? Metaphor is defined as a figure of speech in which a word or phrase, literally denoting one kind of object, is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or an analogy between them. Metaphor derives from the Greek words for transfer or transference, which means to change by carrying. The transformative potential of the metaphor depends on the similarities and differences between its components. It involves the utilization of one conceptual or imaginal domain to map or articulate the experience of a different conceptual or imaginal domain. For example, if we say the ship's prow plows the sea, we're making a metaphor between the way a ship moves through the water and the appearance of a plow moving through the earth. It's linking those two domains and allowing them to communicate and articulate something about the other domain. So here's an example of how metaphor is at the very heart of interpretation. A patient of mine who struggles with a strong, lifelong sense of duty and responsibility, which contributed to the development of an anxiety disorder and a recently emergent chronic illness. She begins to describe the feeling of vigilance and responsibility she experienced with her grandchildren during a recent holiday. She was concerned that her daughter's children are permitted to watch television shows that her son's children aren't allowed to watch. And she wonders aloud what she should do about that. In my reverie, in the thoughts and feelings I'm having while I'm sitting with her, I'm thinking about a movie, The Village by M. Night Shyamalan, in which the residents of the village are always standing watch in towers around the edge of the village to guard against attacks by monsters which are believed to exist in the surrounding forest, but which don't actually exist. I ask, is that your role to mediate these things? He replies, I guess not. That's a relief. Now, while my intervention is accurate, it elicits no strong emotion from her, in part because I have not couched it in a metaphor. I shift to an interpretive mode and say, you survey the horizon looking for problems to mediate. Perhaps it's time to ask yourself whether it's safe to come down from the watchtower. And she immediately bursts into tears, sobbing, and says, I want to. So you can see the content of the interventions, the surface content was the same, but by including the metaphor of the watchtower, it completely changed the impact of the intervention for her. Now, interpretation is not everything that is verbally presented to the patient in a session. It is a specific type of verbal interaction, which sets it apart from other types of therapeutic statements. But before looking at the specifics of what constitutes an interpretation, let's examine a few definitions of interpretation. This is one I find particularly helpful. Interpretation is an invitation for the patient to see their world in a new way. And I can send these slides as a PDF later on after the thing, and they can be distributed if you'd care to. The novelist Henry Miller says, if we're always arriving and departing, it is also true that we are eternally anchored. One's destination is never a place, but rather a new way of looking at things. And that's what an interpretation should do, is provide the patient a new way of looking at things. The poet John O'Donohue says, may my mind come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. And that's also part of the purpose of an interpretation, is it should disrupt old patterns, old narratives, old way of thinking about things, old way of thinking about ourselves. If it's simply a logical statement, it won't have any impact. This is my definition of interpretation. Interpretation is the verbal expression of what is experienced with and understood about the patient's psychological situation, including the field constellated by the analytic dyad. Michael Fordham is a little more explicit. He says an interpretation is composed of that part of the patient's unconscious, digested and thought about by the analyst. The result is then communicated to the patient in such a way as to give meaning to the patient's material. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. I missed the first one. It connects together statements of the patient that have a common source unknown to the patient. So when the analyst tells the patient about the source, he makes an inference that goes beyond the actual material at hand. His next definition is an interpretation is composed of that part of the patient's unconscious. Yes. Oh, I thought there was a question. And thought about by the analyst. The result is then communicated to the patient in such a way as to give meaning to the patient's material. To do this, it must have a clear structure and contain a verb. In other words, an action word. So we need to differentiate between interpretation and supportive interventions. An interpretation can be distinguished from supportive techniques, which are the aspects of therapy which reinforces the patient's perception of the relationship as helpful, accepting, understanding, and supportive. But they're not intended to or expected to increase the patient's insight. Even when utilizing supportive techniques, there is still an absence of advice giving, suggestion, problem solving, etc., which are the domain of counseling situations, not analytic psychotherapy or analysis. Interpretations are specifically intended to expand or increase insight, expand consciousness, and provide an experience of being known and understood. Alden Hyman say psychoanalytic therapy is interpretive rather than suggestive. Principally, the therapist helps through making interpretations. The warm relationship is the necessary context for the interpretive actions of the therapist. Now, naturally, in any therapy, there must be some balance between supportive aspects and interpretive aspects based on the needs, psychological makeup, and presenting problem of the patient. The goal is to be aware of the continuum between supportive interventions and analytic technique, and always making an effort to move closer to the analytic end of the continuum. Here's an example of an exchange that could have stopped at being supportive, but shifted to interpretive. Towards the end of a session, we get to the issue of the patient's mother. He's complaining about the fact that he's recently received a letter and a check of money from his mother, and he's experiencing some anxiety and ambivalence about having to write her back to acknowledge the receipt. I make a comment about the level of anxiety she constellates in him and refer to our previous session in which he mentioned feeling he needed to drink 2 beers before being able to call her back the previous week. So we begin the section. He says, "Oh, you remembered." Now, from a supportive standpoint, I could have stopped there and he would have gotten something from simply being remembered. Or I could have said, "Of course I remembered." But neither of those, even though he would feel good about it, would help him understand himself or how he utilizes me. So I continue. I observe, "You seem surprised that I remembered." He says, "I didn't mean any offense. I just meant that none of my therapists before have ever remembered what I've said from week to week," which saddened me tremendously immediately upon hearing that. I said, "I didn't think you were making a negative comment about me." He said, "Good, because I wasn't. This therapy is really important to me." Now you see how we're moving into the transference. Now I begin to interpret. "I think you were telling me that you don't feel memorable. So it surprises you that I could hold you in my mind." He grins, somewhat embarrassed, as though he's been caught doing something, having a feeling about me. He says, "Well, I know that you see a lot of patients, and it must be hard to keep all of this stuff straight." So I continue the interpretation because he's provided additional material. "You seem to be wondering whether you're important enough to me for me to remember you as an individual among the other people who come into my office." Now he becomes tearful. "I know I'm important to you, and it's really important that I stay with this and finish therapy this time. I've gotten started and quit so many times I can't do this again." So you can see how the interpretation and the relationality of the analytic dyad work together in that situation, as they always do. Most emphasis on interpretation in Jungian psychology is on dream interpretation rather than the interpretation of the analytic interaction and analysis. Jungians have volumes upon volumes about the process of interpreting dreams, but very little literature at all on the interpretation of the analytic process occurring during sessions when dreams aren't being analyzed. The traditional psychoanalytic goal is the resolution of psychic conflicts through the use of interpretation to promote affectively engaged insight, which in turn leads to lasting psychic structural change. Some criticize this traditional model, saying this insight alone isn't sufficient to promote change. But I believe this is more a reflection of how the model has become caricatured in the popular media and by Jungians. But this does not accurately portray Freud's attitude towards insight and the importance of affective engagement in the process. And I'll give you just one example here. This is from his 1915 work, The Unconscious. To have heard something and experienced something are in their psychological nature two quite different things, even though the content of both is the same. James Strachey, in a 1934 article, The Nature of the Therapeutic Action of Psychoanalysis, articulates the action of interpretation for the first time. And he coins the term mutative interpretations to describe interpretations which result in psychological change. In contradiction to the stereotype associated with Freudian psychoanalysis, Strachey indicates every mutative interpretation must be emotionally immediate. The patient must experience it as something actual, and interpretations must always be directed to the point of urgency. And what he goes on to say is often the point of urgency is the patient's experience of the analyst, because the analyst is the person in the room with them. Jungian psychology emphasizes the need to increase consciousness as a byproduct and goal of analysis, with the assumption that consciousness will shift from ego-centeredness towards a point of view more consistent with the totality of the personality, or the self. Analytical psychology uses insight as a tool for increasing consciousness. In Edinger's book, The Creation of Consciousness, he paraphrases Jung and says, the purpose of human life is the creation of consciousness. The passage he takes this from is Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. This is what interpretation is intended to facilitate. So I think Jungian interpretation has three primary goals: to create an opening in consciousness that permits unconscious contents to enter. In order to do this most effectively, the analyst tries to remain aware of the operation of defenses, resistances, and the overall state of the patient's psyche at that moment in time. And the interpretations also should increase the tension of opposites between consciousness and unconscious, so that the transcendent function is activated, which in turn generates symbols to foster the individuation process. As discussed above, the transcendent function cannot perform its role without some degree of consciousness. Therefore, consciousness is both a goal and a vehicle for the transforming aspect of analysis. Interpretation serves to enable the patient to understand unconscious contents symbolically and to assimilate those contents. So the psychoanalytic goal of insight can be thought of as one aspect of consciousness. Now we're going to move towards what I call the cycle of interpretation. We don't have to think about interpretation as just one unitary process. I think it breaks down into four different processes: confrontational observation, inferential clarification, interpretation, and construction. Now I'll start with construction. which is a pattern of interpretations extending over time, perhaps the whole analysis, which give a larger pattern of meaning to a patient's life. In Jungian terms, this would be referred to as the creation or discovery of the personal myth. Those from a psychoanalytic background simply call it construction. The first step, and I think of these steps as kind of like Lego blocks that children play with. They interact, they interlock together. And so we can build up interpretations out of these earlier steps. So a confrontational observation is simply a calling attention to an act or a verbalization of the patient. It is not necessarily confrontational in style, but as a confrontation through engagement of an unconscious process or content. For example, if a patient of mine sits in every session with her purse on her lap and never sets it down, that's a behavior I can observe. I might say, have you noticed how you always seem to hold your purse in your lap in front of you? Now, I'm not stating any reason why she does that. I'm just asking if she can notice that that occurs. So that's the confrontational observation. An interpretation following that observation might sound like this. You seem to feel safer behind your purse. I think because you imagine that it would be painful to have both of us know how you feel and what you want in this process. In other words, I'm describing that she uses her purse as a buffer between us in order to create a feeling of safety. An inferential clarification combines a confrontation with an identification by the analyst of a possible unconscious process. It doesn't yet say why we think that process is there, but it implies something. That's the inference. For example, I've noticed that after I make a comment, you frequently stop speaking your thoughts and feelings and focus exclusively on the comment I've made. You may be doing this to avoid what you feel when I seem to know something about you that catches you off guard. So I've made an inference about that pattern, but haven't yet said anything about what I understand about that pattern. An interpretation gives meaning to events, feelings, or experiences which previously had no meaning or for which the meaning was hidden. It essentially says, this is how I understand what you've said to me and how I understand how it relates to your interior world. And we'll go into a few more examples of these as we go through. But you might wonder, well, how do I know what to include in an interpretation? And there's a couple of useful devices to think through a possible interpretation. One of these is called the triangle of conflict, in which we imagine that the patient has a feeling or a thought that is connected to an unconscious wish, fear, or desire. And there's a defense against that unconscious content. For example, I've noticed in our recent session that you regularly arrive at the end of our time right in the middle of emotionally intense material. This may be a way in which you arrange to feel hurt and cut off. So the hurt and cut off is the material that I would assume is outside the patient's awareness, but that I'm attributing meaning to the behavior that the patient arrives at the end of sessions right in the middle of intense material, despite both of us knowing that the session is typically going to end at 50 minutes. So what we would be the feeling or thought that has been expressed by the patient would be the thing that they could be aware of. They're not likely, because it's unconscious, they're not aware of the wish, fear, or desire they're defending against, and they're not probably not sure how they're defending against this. So our job is to point them, make the confrontational observation towards the feeling or thought that's come into the room, and explain through interpretation the unconscious wish, fear, or desire and how they're defending against that. Another useful device is to think of the interpretation in terms of relationships. So there's past relationships, usually family of origin, current relationships of the patient, could be spouse, children, boss, friends, any of those current relationships that are ongoing, and then the transference relationship. And you can make a link in an interpretation between any two corners of this triangle or all three corners of the triangle. So let's look at an example of an interpretation built up around the relationship triangle. Although you often feel like a victim in such situations, you might consider how you contribute to these conflicts with your husband, current relationship, and then choose to suffer silently through them in order to feel mistreated in a manner similar to the way your mother felt mistreated by your father, past relationships. So by linking current and past, you're actually expanding the power of the relationship by allowing them to see it in more than one context. So there's preparation that goes on for an interpretation. We gather data, we organize that data, we generate a hypothesis in the form of an interpretation, and then we return to data gathering, meaning that we return to our listening perspective. So data gathering is simply listening, observing, feeling, imagining, and paying attention to our reverie, the background of our thoughts while we're sitting with somebody. We organize the data around our knowledge of the patient, our theories of the psyche, and archetypal patterns that we're familiar with. So we attend to content and process of the patient's verbal and nonverbal communications, or lack of. We also attend to emotions, fantasies, slips of tongue, or dreams communicated directly or indirectly to the analyst. We pay attention to shifts in the emotional state of mind or psyche that's when complexes are activated. We attend to shifts in the frame of the analysis, like missed appointments, dealings around money, the time of the appointment, lateness for appointment, a tendency to run over the end of the appointment, or changes in the field of the session, such as shifts in the energy of the room, an increase or decrease in the tempo of our interactions, or shifts in the physiology of the analyst or the analysand, changes in energy level, higher or lower, or abrupt shifts in the content of what's being spoken about. We can also attend to the patient's perception of the therapist's behavior. When the patient says, "You look sleepy today," for example. Patterns of recurrence of symptoms or contexts. As in dreams, repetition emphasizes the importance of the themes. Attending to things with temporal contiguity, meaning things that happen close together, but we don't necessarily see the immediate link between them. What's occurring in the analyst's reverie. Basically attempting to attend to the whole of the analyst's experience of the patient and themselves. To make observations like this, as well as the accompanying interpretations, the analyst's experience must be split into two parts. The experiencing aspect of the analyst, here referred to as the analyst participating ego, even though the experiences may be beyond the experience of the ego. And the analytic ego, sometimes referred to as the working ego or the observing ego, which is separate from and outside the immediate affective state of the patient-analyst interaction, and yet still accesses the sensory affective information being exchanged. So if we feel angry about towards a patient, or erotic feelings towards a patient, or we feel threatened by a patient, we need to be able to register that emotion as real, but also step back from it or outside of it and reflect on what that emotion might mean. In addition to enhancing the analyst's capability of observing and conceptualizing what is happening in an analytic session, it also facilitates the development of the patient's introspection, self-insight, and autonomy, because it models for the patient the ability to reflect upon experience and creates associative connections between bits of experience that were previously unconnected. Hopefully, via this interaction, the patient internalizes this capacity for reflection, which is what Jung refers to as the reflective function. If somebody doesn't have a reflective function, they can't be symbolic. So when we move to conceptualization, this provides a theory around which to organize the data, whether it's Jung's complex theory, Cohutian self-object theory, object relations theory, Freudian structural theory, Freudian drive theory, Kleinian state theory. All these are ways of conceptualizing what's happening between the two individuals. And it also involves our comparison of the current experience of the patient with our previous experience of the patient. From a Jungian perspective, these conceptualizations are mostly framed around the complexes. And here's just a simplified one of one patient with a complex. A patient of mine who regularly had a pattern of self-mutilation. She would either burn herself, cut herself, overtake medications that were damaging to her body. And it was based around a feeling of anger. So I'm stating these all as self-statements from her. I feel angry. I expect others will hurt me or reject me. Other people will hurt me or reject me if I am angry. I should hurt myself instead of expressing my anger. Now, obviously, on a conscious level, she doesn't or didn't think through all of these processes initially. She would simply feel the feeling, I want to hurt myself, and act on it. Only by introducing this conceptualization to her, linking it to her anger and her assumption that she would be rejected by others if she's angry, or that she'll be hurt if she's angry in the presence of another, did she come to be able to begin to alter that pattern of self-mutilation. So again, these triangles that I introduced are simply ways of generating a hypothesis to offer the patient in the form of an interpretation. This is one that I didn't introduce previously, which I call the symbolic triad, where we can move back and forth between an interpersonal context, subject and object, an intrapsychic process such as the relationship between ego and self or ego and complexes, and the archetypal dimension, which is on the continuum between personal and collective. So any of these three triangles we could utilize to generate the content of an interpretation. Part of what we have to do is listening for derivative or encoded messages. These are communications in which the surface or manifest content appears to be about something else, but is referring to an encoded or latent message. from a session with a patient of mine who's a therapist herself. She's telling me about hearing from a former child patient, now an adolescent, via Facebook. Her former patient has written to tell her how much my patient has helped him. My patient has maintained contact with the patient's mother via Facebook. The patient is discussing her recognition that she should not be in contact with the boy because of boundary issues, but seems unaware that contact with the mother via Facebook is also a boundary issue. She indicates that she knows she should defriend the boy on Facebook after acknowledging his message, but is having difficulty doing so. I inquire what feels difficult about that. She said she didn't want him to feel rejected and was afraid they might need to contact her in the future. Now, I knew she was considering leaving analysis in recent months. And I say to her, perhaps there is a fantasy you have in the background of your thoughts in which you wonder how you'll maintain a feeling of connection with me after we end our therapy. She replies, yes, that's sad to think about. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if I can or even if I want to try to do that. Later in the same session, she mentions how she had several times during the week thought about emailing me about certain bits of information, but refrained from that and thought how she shouldn't be crossing boundaries and should hold these bits until her next session. So you can see, even though she didn't realize she was talking about our relationship in presenting this dilemma, she was actually talking about our relationship and the conflict she has about staying or leaving, and whether she has the emotional knowledge about how to maintain a feeling of contact with me after therapy ends. Connected to this is listening to symptoms as faulty coping mechanisms, where Jung says the outbreak of a neuroses is an attempt at self-cure. It is an attempt of the self-regulating psychic system to restore balance, in no way different from the function of dreams. So when a patient says, oh, my chest is tight, we need to think, oh, they're telling me a dream right now. When a patient blushes in a session, we need to think, oh, this is a dream that's occurring in the patient's body right now. So often, if we hold that in mind, then interpretation will be framed to help the patient see that what they are doing to protect themselves also has the effect of hurting themselves in another way. We also need to understand affective shifts and symptoms as compensatory processes, reflecting one-sidedness of their psychic orientation. So listening for where the tension of opposites is constellated or not constellated. About 6 months later, after this previous Facebook example, the same patient comes in expressing her ambivalence and discomfort about continuing in her analysis, wondering why she continues an analysis, feeling that she is somehow betraying herself by doing so, but at the same time not wanting to leave analysis. Now, this is emerging following an intensely experienced erotic transference that lasted about 1.5 years. During this session, she's telling me about talking to her friends, who are also primarily therapists, and how it makes her feel better to talk about these feelings, but also makes her feel more conflicted. So there's a tension that I want to bring into focus about her two needs for me. I say there's a tension inside about needing to feel I'm above you. In other words, idealizing me, so that you can feel I can be helpful to you, but then feeling resentment about being my patient, which feels like we're not equals and therefore cannot be lovers. So I brought in the idealizing transference and the erotic transference and her defense against the idealizing transference all in one interpretation. So now we move to interpretation proper. An interpretive hypothesis takes into account both the theory and the data that we've gathered through listening and feeling, which will be communicated in the form of an interpretation. I believe the analysand does, thinks, or feels, or experiences this because of this. That's the basic fundamental. Obviously, we're hopefully more creative in filling this out, but that's the basic format. That's what we're trying to sort out in our mind before we say it aloud to the patient. So a few cautions about interpreting: avoid use of jargon. Cohutians talk about interpreting from an experience near position. What this means in part is to avoid the use of concepts like shadow, ego, persona, anima, individuation in formulating interpretations to the patient. It's more accessible to the patient to operationalize these concepts in simple terms. They don't need to learn about shadow. They need to learn what they've disowned. So instead of using the term shadow, we might say the part of you that is difficult for you to accept in yourself, or the aspects of yourself that you would like to forget about or disown. Then we've communicated the operation of shadow without giving it a conceptual name, which reifies something rather than it brings us closer to an experience of something. Or another example, if we said, I think you're experiencing me as your father, is very different than saying you're projecting your father onto me. One brings it closer to experience, the other distances it. It's possible to get through an entire analysis without teaching the patient any Jungian terms. I'm not saying that that's the ideal, or that we should never offer a term for the patient to hold on to, but I much prefer to try to find the terms in the patient's own language or dream imagery. For example, a patient who had a horrendous father complex had a dream about a man in a gray suit that wouldn't let her leave the building because she hadn't followed the rules. And so I asked for her associations, and she said, well, my father worked in the airline industry, and he had a closet full of dark suits, brown, gray, black, blue. And that's what I remember so vividly about him, is his dark suits. So from then on, instead of saying your father complex, or you're experiencing me as your father, I would say things like, it seems as though the man in the gray suit has come into the room. And then that's using the metaphor that emerges from the patient's own psyche. We can also frame interpretations, and should frame interpretations, in terms of actions, real or imagined, both private and public. In other words, private actions are things that people think but don't necessarily do. Public actions are things that they say or do that others could observe. Actions include feeling, sensing, thinking, and choosing, and are best designated by verbs and adverbs, which are qualifiers to verbs, rather than nouns. Nouns are terms that name things, or adjectives that modify nouns, which tend to reify and turn things into entities. Anytime we use language like, oh, you're dependent, or you're introverted, or you're grandiose, or you're obsessive, we're turning things into nouns and adverbs. Use of is or are, you are, or this is, tend to imply static, unchangeable aspects of personality, whereas act and behave, you act as if, or you behave as if, these imply non-static, changeable aspects of personality. Always try to locate the action being described within a particular intrapsychic or interpersonal context. For example, you seem to feel more depressed when you experience the negative inner voice of your father, versus your depression builds when your father complex is active. One makes it changeable, the other makes it static. And be as specific as possible when interpreting. Avoid vague words and phrases like something in you, or a place in you, or a part of you. If you aren't able to be more specific about the feeling or aspect of the psyche you're attempting to form an interpretation around, perhaps you should wait until you have more information or have developed a clearer idea. Use affective language, language couched in emotional words, because affects are the most fleeting of all clinical experiences. You can get back to memories, images, thoughts, ideas, and concepts relatively easily, but it's often difficult to reaccess an affect once the initial moment is past. Attempt to link behaviors, actions that you are interpreting with an affect. Be as specific as possible when attempting to link an affect being experienced by the patient to a behavior or defense. And interpretations based on metaphor are almost always better than at involving the patient and at an affective level. For example, a patient is discussing a possible trip with his partner to the area where his mother is in a nursing home, and he's got a very conflicted relationship with his mother. Considering this possibility, he says, "I'm afraid of being overwhelmed by my feelings if I see my mother. I'm also afraid of being trapped by being alone with Sam. It's hard to get to the bottom of what I feel, but I have no life." Now, this is a patient who was given to strong emotional outbursts and attacks on his partner. I say, "You feel controlled by other people's emotional needs." He says, "Yes, I do." I say, "You're afraid there will be expectations." He agrees, "Yes." Speaking to his tendency to get angry and become explosive in such situations, I interpret. So to avoid feeling controlled by anyone's expectation, you strap on a suicide vest and blow everything up, also preventing you from meeting any of your emotional needs in relationships. So the suicide vest is the metaphor there, and blowing things up. He laughs quietly and nods. In subsequent sessions, he continued to refer to this image metaphor and even discussed the idea of the suicide vest and blowing things up with his partner. Naturally, timing is of essence in offering interpretations. It's a crucial issue based on experience, judgment, intuition, knowledge of the patient, and connection to one's own countertransference. Sometimes we are too conservative and miss opportunities and openings which may or may not present themselves again. Sometimes we interpret prematurely, engaging in the projection of our own psychic contents, prematurely presenting material for which the patient isn't ready, or overwhelming the patient's defenses. In some instances, interpretations or the need to interpret must be held for long periods of time before the psychic conditions are appropriate. In one analysis, there was a behavior that the patient did that I found quite bothersome and off-putting or repulsive, but I didn't really understand it. And I waited literally 8 years before I came to an awareness of what it was and was able to offer an interpretation that I felt the patient could see, understand, and feel known through. I simply let her do it until I felt I understood it. Then anytime we interpret, we should listen for the response to the interpretation. So if you imagine a quiet pond, we throw a stone into the pond. The stone is the interpretation, and the little ripples out from the entry of the stone into the water are the things we should be listening for and attending to see whether the interpretation has gone in has been inaccurate or been defended against. So if an interpretation is mutative, in other words, psychologically effective, and made at an appropriate time, there will be a shift or opening up. The patient will reveal or remember more that is connected to the interpretation. They will have an association. Oh, that makes me think of the time when, or they'll pause to reflect. Their breathing or posture will shift. There will be a noticeable shift in emotion, such as tears, anger, which is usually emotionally congruent with the thrust of the interpretation. Or they will agree in some way that has an affective contiguity to it, and there is a sense of aha in the room. In a defended response, the patient will actively disagree in a way that precludes further examination. But an overtly negative reaction to an interpretation does not necessarily mean the interpretation wasn't effective. The patient will shift subjects, avoid. They will continue with what they were saying before the interpretation, which is referred to as incorporation. Or they will agree verbally, but it feels just as though it's on the surface, and there's no felt or affective sense of response to the interpretation. So we're getting towards the end here. This is simply an overview slide reminding you of gathering the data, organizing it, generating a hypothesis in the form of an interpretation, and return to data gathering. That's my internal cycle that I'm always going through. Now let's shift a little bit more specifically to Jungian interpretation, which is naturally centered primarily around complexes. And we might remember that Jung thought of calling his psychology complex psychology rather than analytical psychology. Many variations on this, but involving the complexes of the father, authority, responsibility, money, power, mother, shadow, anima, animus, persona, ego, or in the case of psychosis or narcissistic conditions, the state of the self. The task is to figure out a means to speak to the complex itself rather than just to the ego, and develop a sense of how the complex will receive the interpretation rather than lapsing into the belief or practice that we are only speaking to the ego of the patient. When we lapse into speaking only to the ego, we tend to phrase our interpretation in logical, emotionally distant language rather than phrases that speak to the affective logic of the wounded aspects of the psyche. So sometimes we do speak to the ego, and it sounds very different than if we're speaking to a child complex that's constellated. We don't speak to a 5-year-old psychologically in the same way we speak to a 35-year-old. So I want to give you an example of this using a patient who is psychotic, episodically psychotic, not schizophrenic. And like most psychotic patients, she introjects content interpretations as "you don't believe me." In other words, when there's something delusional happening and we offer a rational explanation of that, that distances us from the patient. This patient is able to take in parts of an interpretation if I tie it to the affective content of her projected delusional process. In this session, she was preoccupied with her adult daughter sneaking into her house and taking her possessions. In reality, this may have occurred occasionally, but it would be physically impossible to happen with the frequency or extent that the patient contends it does. So I choose not to confront the reality of that experience at all. And I'll break this into 4 parts. Now, as you're listening, if I don't do the first 2 parts, she can't accept the second 2 parts. When you feel that you can't keep your daughter from coming into your house and taking your things, so I'm labeling this a feeling rather than disputing whether it's a fact or not. I think there is also a sense that this is also happening inside of you as well. So I'm making a parallel between what happens outside and what happens inside without ever questioning whether it happens outside. Now, she comes from a childhood background in which there were few boundaries. They weren't even allowed to have doors on the doorways of their bedrooms or lock the bathroom door. So I now shift. It feels as if you can't keep the feelings and thoughts of others from invading your mind and stealing away with bits and pieces of you. So I've made a link between a metaphor of stealing physical objects to stealing internal objects. Now I link it back to the past relationship context. I think this reminds you of the situation you grew up in where there were no boundaries, no personal space, no sense of personal possessions, and no room to have your own thoughts. And that's where the interpretation ends. So I accept her delusional process and work inside the delusional process. And in a sense, every complex is like a small psychosis. It has its own unique view of the world. So what we're attempting to do is to link the patient's comments, actions, and experiences to the analyst's understanding and functioning of the patient's primary core complexes. So everybody's familiar with this, that every complex has an archetypal core and a personalistic overlay. Now, what's different is that most of the time people don't describe what's in the personalist or think about what's in the personalistic overlay. So I want to do a little bit of explication of that. So if we keep the same slide, because there is an archetypal core, there are some universal patterns, in addition to the more personalistic manifestations, which have a tendency to become constellated in a positive or negative configuration. So this would be positive or negative. Positive mother complex, negative mother complex, or a split in which they vacillate or have an enantiodromia between the positive and the negative. And then that's going to influence the personalistic overlay. Now, what's in that? Memories, images, feelings, behavioral patterns, defenses, cognitive sets, specific values or attitudes, specific physiological states, and patterns of object relatedness. So we could pick out any one of these elements or several of them to include in an interpretation, just as I picked out the memory of the patient's childhood situation and the feeling that there were no boundaries, no defenses. So this is kind of a useful way of helping yourself break down, okay, what piece of the complex can I address or do I want to address? What piece of the complex is available to the patient's consciousness if I point it out to them? It's this interaction between the archetypal core and the personalistic overlay which results in the life drama, the narrative structure, or the personalistic myth. So again, we want to use as much as possible descriptive terms rather than conceptual terms. It seems that the part of you which feels abandoned, rather than saying your abandonment complex. Instead of saying the child complex, we would say the childlike part of you. If somebody has a particular pattern of seduction and being seduced, we could say the part of you that can seduce and the part which can't, of you which can be seduced. Or this seems to be an instance in which you can behave towards yourself in a very domineering and aggressive way towards yourself, rather than saying the internal persecutor, for example. Instead of giving it a label, we can describe what happens. And then over time, the patient picks up that description and perhaps forms their own name for that process. It isn't sufficient to or even effective to simply identify the existence of a complex. It's the functioning of the complex that must be reflected on by the analyst sufficiently so that it can be explained in experiential, affective, behavioral language to the patient. This is what Jung calls the circumambulation of the complex, and we would do it via interpretation, which has several benefits for the patient. It allows them to recognize cues which signal the activation of the complex. For example, somebody who's thinking about walking into their boss's office to ask for a raise might constellate their own authority complex in that situation, and then operate out of their authority complex rather than their ego complex. It helps the patient recognize how the complex relates to interpersonal problems. Oh, when all of this stuff around my father is happening, that interferes with my relationship with my husband. It helps them recognize the power of the complex. It provides insights into the origins of the complex. It helps them understand the secondary gain aspects of the symptoms, as well as the symptom as an effort of self-cure. And through this talking through and understanding the complex, ultimately it diminishes the power of the complex and provides the acquisition of a greater range of emotional and behavioral patterns, which is ultimately the goal. Without that greater freedom of range of emotion and behavior, we can't individuate. So this comes from Hans Dieckmann, and we can think about any complex as having a past, which is how the complex came into being, the present, which is how the complex impacts the patient's current experiences, and the future, which is where the complex is taking the patient. So any interpretation can be formed around how it developed, how it's operating, or where it's taking the patient. So let's just give a look at a couple of examples of the difference between an interpretation stated in a personalistic way and the same interpretation stated in a more archetypal language. Personalistic. You had no boundaries growing up, so now you have trouble setting them with others. So now you want me to do that for you. This came out of a interaction with a patient who wanted me to call her husband and explain to the husband why she was the way she was, and therefore why she couldn't go on this trip he wanted her to go on with him. If I stated that more archetypally, it would say, in the unfolding of your life, it doesn't appear that your capacity to experience yourself as a warrior, and hence to protect yourself, was ever constellated. And now you want me to carry the function of the warrior for you. The thrust is essentially the same, but the universality of the experience is now couched in the metaphor of the warrior. So the same types of interventions that we would use in dream interpretations are often the same ones we might want to use in analyzing the analytic interaction. This is the final example I'll give you. In my reverie, I'm thinking about literal experience versus narrative experience, as a patient is describing her thoughts about being tied down in reference to her abuse history as a child, being sexually and physically abused. Then in reference to the expectations of her husband during her marriage, she says, the ropes are all gone and I'm still fighting now. So I hear her metaphor of ropes and I pick up on that. And I say, you keep living in the present as though it's the past, so the ropes will always be there. Moving to new associative material, she replies, that comes up with money too. I charge money that I don't have so I won't feel constrained or powerless. Again, if there's an association where she links my interpretation to something in her present life or her past life, this signals the likely mutative impact of the interpretation. Essentially, with any interpretation, we're saying, I want you to understand this about yourself, your life, your thought patterns, your behavior, your feeling. And we do that by listening to their story and linking it to our theories and our archetypal knowledge. So in conclusion, the analyst must register the session with the eyes, ears, and heart of a sensualist, while translating those experiences with the mind of a philosopher and the voice of a poet. All right, so I think we can end at that point and open up for discussion.
Tá ótimo. Obrigado, Mark. Uma tremenda aula sobre a questão da interpretação. Muitas questões, muitas dúvidas. A gente vai abrir aqui para os comentários, ok? Tudo bem, Isa? Vamos lá. Mark, eu tinha uma questão para você. Ao terminar de ler o teu livro, bom, vou começar de novo. A pergunta seria, por que você acha que dentro do campo junguiano existe tanto preconceito contra a questão da interpretação? Ao ler o seu livro, a impressão que eu tenho é que a gente descobre que a interpretação é uma técnica que ela pode ser ensinada e transmitida. E me parece que isso abala uma certa versão clássica junguiana de que o analista deve atender movido mais pela sua intuição, por uma espécie de um dom natural que ele tem, e que o uso da interpretação seria algo que descaracterizaria o processo junguiano. Queria te ouvir um pouco sobre isso.
Yes, that's certainly a characteristic that I find in many parts of the Jungian world. People that have trained in London or are otherwise trained as developmental Jungian analysts don't share this same prejudice. But in general, that is a prejudice I find present in the Jungian world. And for the very reasons that you named, is that Jung felt strongly that it was the personality of the analyst that was, in a sense, the transformative factor. And many of the first generation Jungians were intuitive feelers. And intuitives, as we know from the description in typology, don't like methodologies. They feel constrained by methodologies. But what that's resulted in is the development of what Freud would call wild analysis, saying often whatever comes to mind without thinking about how it's framed and what the potential impact might be on the patient. And so while there's certainly an importance to listening to our intuition, and I listen to mine frequently, I'm an introverted thinking intuitive. So intuition is a commonplace experience for me, but I have a layer in between the experience of my intuition and what I say to the patient, where the intuition might lead me to the area I want to speak about, but then the technique of interpretation helps me refine my intuition and present it in a form that's more usable to the patient. As Barbara Stevens Sullivan, who's a Jungian analyst in California, wrote in her book on Bion and Jung, she said, there's no one right way to interpret, and there's many possible good interpretations, but there's also many bad ways to interpret. So I think of it as a tool that we use. And just as an artist who learns to paint often starts with sketches, and they learn how to sketch first. And then they learn about different brushes, different textures of paint, and they practice the technique of painting. Now, that doesn't remove their creativity or their intuition. And we can see that the expression is still tied to the individual. So if we look at a painter like Escher, who does very intricate pen and ink drawings that look extremely detailed and rigid, but they also distort perspective so that people are walking up the downside of an upside down staircase, and we wonder, how can that be? And yet he represents it. And at the same time, an artist like Joan Mitchell, who does gestural painting, which is completely intuitive, and she just waits with her brush near the canvas, and then when she's moved, she puts the brush to the canvas and moves in the way she feels. But both of these individuals have this other background where they've learned technique and where they've chosen to individualize the technique they use. So I think it's compatible with any typology, and your typology is going to influence how you utilize technique and methodology, but that it's a tool that every analyst needs to know how to do, how to have experience with, because otherwise we're kind of like trying to play pin the tail on the donkey, which is, I guess that's a childhood game everywhere, but often our intuitions lead us to make wild interpretations that have not been refined and thought through.
Obrigado, Mark. Vamos abrir para perguntas. Quem quiser fazer pergunta, bota o nome no chat que eu chamo, tá? A Letícia Capirotti quer fazer uma. Letícia, por favor.
É mais um comentário do que uma pergunta. Eu quero dizer para o Mark que eu estou muito contente de vê-lo falar para um público brasileiro. Eu já o conhecia e gosto demais, não só das ideias, mas do modo como ele articula. Então, eu acho que eu sempre quis expandir isso, sempre quis trazê-lo, e agradeço muito ao Marcos por ter feito essa ponte, por estar atingindo tanta gente. Eu acho que nos dá muitas ferramentas, especificamente. E eu queria pedir para o Marco falar, porque eu sei que ele está lançando um livro agora e tem um outro livro que ele vai lançar no ano que vem, que vai expandir um dos capítulos desse livro sobre a interpretação, sobre o qual ele acabou de nos falar. Então, eu queria que ele falasse um pouquinho sobre isso.
Well, Letitia's prejudice, because she and I are friends from the Interregional Society, but thank you. Future ideas. There's a chapter in the book called Cultivating the Analytic Attitude, and that is one that I think can easily be expanded into a full book on its own. And it's I think a characteristic of analysis that's always implied or inferred, but again, we don't have a text that speaks about it specifically, just as we didn't have a text that speaks about interpretation specifically. So I think there's a need for that in the book, of not that there is one analytic attitude, but we need to cultivate an understanding about what our analytic attitude is. What are the values that we bring into analysis, and we try to communicate to the patient about their encounter with themselves. So that's one I'd like to expand. I'm currently working with a Romanian analyst named Lavinia Translescu, who's done a series of interviews with older analysts that are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I'm helping her edit that book, and that'll appear sometime next year, we hope. So those are the two projects that I'm working on currently.
Obrigado, Letícia. alguma pergunta, gente? Vamos lá. Letícia, então faz o seguinte, eu faço uma, depois você faz a outra, tá? Mark, a gente poderia concluir que existe um triângulo que seria interpretação, transferência e metáfora? Como se isso fosse, cada um desses termos convocasse o outro. Quer dizer, é impossível fazer uma interpretação que não esteja suportada na transferência e que essa interpretação ela é mais efetiva se ela adotar um estilo metafórico. Interpretação, metáfora e transferência.
Ideally, yes, I would say that as much as possible, metaphor should be the primary ground of the interpretation. Now, of course, metaphor relies on our own imagination and our own symbolic capacity. So there's going to be instances where a metaphor doesn't appear to us that speaks to the situation at hand. But if the timing was right, I would still form an interpretation that explains, even if I couldn't use a metaphor. I think the transference is always implicit in every interaction. There's going to be times where I move from the explicit articulation of the transference to the implicit experience of it. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't necessarily feel like I always have to include the transference in an interpretation, but when I can, it deepens the experience of the interpretation because they feel my presence at the moment of interpretation. So yes, I would say in general, your comment that there's a triangle between transference, interpretation, and metaphor, and that they're interrelated, but that I might not always speak in metaphor and I might not always include the transference, but they're there implicitly.
Ótimo. Letícia, vamos deixar você para depois. Sérgio Azen, faz a pergunta, Sérgio, por favor.
Vamos lá. Eu estou aqui almoçando esse horário, vamos aqui abrir a câmera. Eu queria saber do Marco, uma dica, claro, não existe uma verdade absoluta, de como a gente pode ficar atento durante o processo analítico, no sentido de o processo de a contratransferência, ou seja, do analista para o paciente, não comprometer o processo de interpretação. Porque isso é um desafio, né? A gente acaba contratransferindo e isso pode atrapalhar o processo de interpretação. Qual é a dica que o Mark dá nesse sentido?
Well, it depends on how you think about countertransference. The narrow definition of countertransference is our unresolved conflicts that are activated in the course of the analysis. The broader countertransference is the idea that almost anything that we feel, think, or do is in response to the patient. So we should always be scanning our countertransference with the wondering of how is this connected to the patient and the patient's interior world. So there's two approaches that are talked about. One approach is to speak of the countertransference. In other words, if I'm feeling angry at the patient, to tell the patient I'm angry. I don't find that very helpful very often. So often I'm speaking from the countertransference, which means I'm using my countertransference to inform what I'm saying to the patient. So, for example, particularly in things like aggression and eroticism, it's easy to constellate overwhelming experiences if we speak of our countertransference rather than from our countertransference. So let's imagine a patient who strikes me as very attractive and interesting, but finds herself unattractive and uninteresting. Well, there's an incongruity between her self-perception and my perception of her. So I'm going to try to find a way to harness my feelings of attraction to speak to her in a way that helps her discover her own attractiveness and her own interesting characteristics of her personality. Not that she adopts, so that she's not adopting my view of her, but I speak to her in a way that she can discover those qualities in herself and work through the conflicts that prevent her from seeing those things in the first place. So I can give you a short example of that. So a few sessions back, I had the reverie of women. There's a certain, she was talking about growing older and how she kind of is sad about how she didn't appreciate her youth and what she was impeded from doing in her youth because of her feelings about herself. And I had this reverie about how there's certain women that arrive at a certain age and the aging process actually deepens their attractiveness. And I came up with two examples in my reverie of an American actress and two American actresses, one Diane Lane, who's more recent, and one Audrey Hepburn, who's from the 40s and 50s. And I commented on that aloud, and I just said, it's interesting, isn't it, that some women actually deepen their beauty as they age, and just left it at that. And then several sessions later, I said, I wondered when I spoke about Lane and Hepburn, whether you had any sense of whether I was talking about you or not. So then that begins to allow her to wonder. I'm not saying whether, in other words, I'm not overtly saying this is about you, but I'm pointing to her and saying, did you have the thought that this might be about you? I might be commenting on you. And she said, no, that thought didn't enter my mind at all. And I said, well, that's interesting, isn't it? That something I said aloud in the session didn't have a reference, you felt didn't have a reference point in you. So that's a little example of how I'm speaking from the countertransference rather than about the countertransference. If I was speaking about the countertransference, I would simply say, oh, I think you're a very attractive and interesting person, which might help a little bit, but it's not going to transform anything in her. She could use my words as kind of a bolster against her feelings of inferiority, but she probably couldn't find them in herself. But if I point out how she defends against knowledge of that, then she has the opportunity to discover that in herself. I hope that's a helpful example about utilizing one's countertransference. Of course, it can also be negative experiences. You know, somebody who talks excessively and doesn't leave any room for me to interact with them. And so, like, I felt was with one particular patient who was rather narcissistically oriented and whose wife complained that he was narcissistically oriented. I also found myself becoming frustrated that he didn't leave any room for me in the session. And so he's exiting the session one day, And he says, well, I really want to hear what you have to say about what I'm talking about. And I said, well, in order to hear what I have to say, you might have to leave room for me in the session. And that was the whole interpretation. And he left and walked out the door, but he came back and it was clear that that had gotten. So I don't speak to him about my anger or my frustration. I speak to him about his behavior that leads to my frustration and anger. He doesn't need to know about the frustration and anger immediately, but he needs to know what he's doing that leads to those reactions in other people.
Obrigado, Mark. Obrigado, Sérgio. Luciana Ximenes e depois a Daniela Lascani. Lu.
Mark, super obrigada pela sua palestra. Conforme eu fui escutando, eu tinha perguntas para fazer que você ia respondendo conforme você ia continuando sua explanação. Eu confesso que eu faço parte desse pessoal aí que o Marcos falou que não tem um certo preconceito de interpretação, né? Eu sempre fui da linha de que não se interpreta numa sessão analítica, né? Só que aí você falou uma coisinha aí no final que foi que a gente interpreta, que a gente conversa com o complexo, né? Que a gente não está conversando, muitas vezes a gente não está interpretando o ego, a gente está interpretando o complexo. E isso fez muito sentido para mim, né? E aí eu fiquei pensando se isso a gente não podia até dizer que é uma forma, a interpretação pode ser uma forma de decodificar o que o complexo está falando lá na sessão, né? E aí eu mudei a pergunta, né? E assim, mudei meu modo de ver, vamos dizer assim, a interpretação nesse momento, e a minha pergunta é, existe análise sem interpretação? Se a gente contar que a interpretação é uma decodificação do que o paciente está falando para a gente, é possível existir uma análise sem a interpretação?
Personally, I don't think it is possible. Why would we offer dream interpretations and not interpret the other aspects of the analysis, would be my question. Why does it seem like the logical thing to do, based on Jung's writings, to interpret dreams, which are an unconscious manifestation, and not interpret the presence of the unconscious in the other parts of the analysis? So to me, it's an extension of Jung's approach rather than a contradiction of his approach. I think your word of decoding is certainly appropriate to describe interpretation, but there's so many things that go on in an analysis, some of which have to be made explicit, that can't be made explicit through the asking of questions or through the relational movements of support. You know, if we say, oh, that was terrible that happened to you, we're empathically connecting to them, and perhaps that's the first time they've felt empathically connected to around that experience. But it helps heal, but it doesn't provide the full understanding of how the trauma impacted them. So the American novelist Aldous Huxley said, experience isn't what happens to us. It's what we do with what happens to us. The problem is most patients don't have an idea about, they know the experience often, unless they've completely dissociated it or repressed it, but they don't know how they've written it into their soul. So that's what we're trying to do, is make explicit how they've written their experiences into their soul. So I don't think it can be done without interpretation at certain points in the analysis.
Obrigado, Mark. Obrigado, Lu.
Obrigada, Mark. Obrigada.
Dani Lascani.
Oi. Oi, Mark, obrigada pela sua palestra. Foi muito bom te ouvir, foi muito bom te conhecer. À medida que você foi falando, me vieram algumas imagens e fiquei me questionando como é que você olha assim, para reações espontâneas nas sessões, como um espanto, uma surpresa, né? Se você considera isso como interpretação ou parte da interpretação como efeito sobre o paciente.
Well, I think that that's what I'm listening for after I'm listening on two phases. I'm listening for those exact things and trying to formulate the interpretation. And then I'm listening for those same things in reaction to the interpretation. And then I'm going to modify the line I'm interpreting along based on the reaction. So sometimes I realize, oh, I presented material that was too emotionally intense and I've overwhelmed the patient. And then I'll step back and consolidate and help them recover from my overwhelming them. And part of that might be these spontaneous reactions you're referring to. But sometimes those spontaneous reactions, even when they're negative, are actually telling me that the interpretation was effective. So this patient that I spoke about with the Facebook page, one of her favorite things to say to me was, oh, that just makes me want to put an ice pick in your head. And she would say it quite humorously and angrily at the same time. But anytime she said that, I knew that I was connecting with something important, because the pattern was so predictable that it was only things that she disliked like that were truly important to interpret for her. So, for example, she was in her mid-30s and still had a credit card from her father for gasoline purchases. And I said something like, well, I wonder when you're going to stop being the princess to your father. And she got angry and said, what do you mean? And I said, well, it strikes me that there's a part of you that wants to hold on to this credit card because it serves as a reminder for you that you're still living within your father's house. And she said, well, do you mean I need to give it up in order to be independent from my father? And I said, well, I don't know whether that's what you need to do, but it certainly seems as if having this credit card keeps you in a very daughter-like state of mind. And that's one of those instances where she wants to put an ice pick in my head. I'm not sure if I quite answered the question. I'm not whether that was focused enough to what these spontaneous occurrences that were being referred to in the question.
Obrigado, Dani. Nadir, tá por aí, Nadir?
Oi, Marcos, boa tarde, tô sim. Oi, Mark, tudo bem?
Hello.
Hello. Obrigada pela palestra de hoje. Minha cabeça está com muitas perguntas agora, mas eu acabei de comprar o teu livro para Kindle na Amazon. Então, vamos lá. A minha pergunta é sobre o tempo certo para fazer uma interpretação. Como é que a gente... Acho que é difícil saber, ter certeza, né? Não sei de qual que realmente é o momento correto. Eu queria saber se você tem algo que você utiliza dentro de você como uma espécie de bússola para saber qual que é esse momento de fazer a interpretação, e se você acha que o analista pode usar a sua intuição para saber essa hora correta.
Well, I think it's both. I think you know, I've been practicing as a psychologist for 33 years and practicing as an analyst for 21 years. And so there's certainly clinical experience that's built up over time that I think goes beyond intuition. I think there's several things that come to mind about that. Is as I'm listening to a patient and formulating an interpretation in my mind, I kind of ask myself, am I going to get another window of opportunity for this? Because often patients quickly go by something and that window closes. And so I have to be ready to step through the window if I think it's the right time. As I said, for this other patient that I waited 8 years, it's because I didn't understand what I needed to interpret. So I can give that example very quickly, I think. This was a person who was very successful in her career, but had not completed her university training. But she was in charge of multi-million-dollar budgets and companies over quite a long period of time in the financial industry. And so, but she decided to go back to college, and she comes back into the room one day. Now, she had gotten a divorce during the course of the analysis that was terribly traumatic for her, and she wept and cried profusely almost every session for these 8 years. And her mascara would run and her nose would run, and she would wipe her hands and her face with her hands. And then there was a pillow on my couch, and she would then wipe her hands on my pillow, which I found distasteful. But I didn't say anything about it. And there was a Kleenex box, a box of tissues sitting next to her that she never used. Now, I could have simply said, would you mind using a Kleenex instead of the pillow? And she would have been perfectly happy to do that, but neither of us would have understood something. So I just kept letting her do it, and I would have to clean the pillow. And for 8 years, this went on. And finally, she goes back to college, and she comes into the session in complete tears immediately. And I say, what's wrong? And she says, I'm only a month into the semester, and I've already filled up my notebook. Now, she was using one of these notebooks that is spiral bound, and you can't add pages to it. You can take pages out, but you can't add. And I looked at her very concretely, and I said, you know, some people buy one notebook per class. And she said, completely astonished, and said, really? And I said, yes. And she said, I could buy one notebook per class, and then they wouldn't fill up so quickly. Now, this is a person who has very good executive functioning skills and knows how to run complex companies. And I said, so then the light bulb went off, and I knew I could interpret. She didn't understand that resources available around her are available to her. So I said, yes, just as you haven't seen that the tissues in the box sitting next to you are also available for your use. And she looked at the box and said, completely seriously, has that always been there? And I said, yes. She literally had not seen the tissues, because this defense against being aware that there are resources available for her use were present for her. So from then on, she never wiped her hands on the pillow again, always used a tissue. And I never said anything about her wiping her hands on the pillow. But she learned something about herself from that one interpretation. So timing can vary widely. Sometimes we have to form and offer an interpretation in just a few moments. And other times we might have to hold them for a year or 2 years or 8 years. So it's a combination of knowledge of the patient, intuition, clinical experience.
Ok, muito obrigada, Mark. Excelente resposta, muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Nadia. Duas perguntas. Sven, Sven que está no México, e a Marta Chagas depois, tá? Sven, tudo bom? Contigo. Sven, microfone.
Sí, obrigado por la oportunidad y licencia por mi portuñol. Mas acho muito interessante que Mark fala de la janela de la una oportunidad y cómo aprovechar ese momento para intervenir. Y aunque no faló explícitamente de cuándo entonces, gostaria eu escutar mais acerca del timing, de cuándo entonces y cómo percibir y ser sensible al momento preciso, al tema de timing. Agradeceria muito se Mark podia falar pouquinho mais.
Well, I can offer advice. I came to interpretation through one specific supervisor named Mel Marshak, who had trained in London. And I could tell that in my training, it was largely people who had trained in Zurich or people who had trained in the interregional. And I could tell she was doing something completely different, but I had no idea what it was until I went to the psychoanalytic literature and started reading about interpretation. And she was able to so much more concisely and effectively speak to what was going on in the patient's psyche, whereas everybody else was kind of muddling around and asking questions, but you could tell they were somewhat shots in the dark. Now, what that led to was me being in supervision with her and me recording and transcribing my sessions. So during the time I was in control, I was recording every single session, transcribing it from the audio tape, and then bringing it to supervision. And she would comment on, well, you missed this. You overwhelmed the patient with this. You weren't consulting your countertransference in this situation. So she would give me feedback on the progress of it, the moment to moment, session to session. Then I discovered that the psychoanalytic literature is very different than the Jungian literature. Not only do they have literature about interpretation, but they're also willing to publish their case transcripts. So in the psychoanalytic journals, there's dozens and dozens of transcripts of psychoanalytic sessions with commentary from other analysts. And so I learned a great deal about timing and phrasing of interpretations from reading those transcripts. So I think this issue of timing can't be explained. It comes through experience. And it comes from looking at your own work, learning to self-supervise your own work, and that just comes from the hard work of transcribing your own sessions, something that I continue to do to this day, and present my own work as I did today, of word for word. Those aren't recalled from memory. Those are recalled from recordings of sessions. I'm not reproducing something that I remember. I'm actually recording exactly what was said, and I only use those examples in my clinical writing with the permission of the patient. So this is the practice part of it. Timing, the knowledge of timing comes through practice and by reviewing what we've done previously. And at first it's difficult, but it's like any skill, the more we practice it, the more nuanced and effective we become at it. So I don't have any particular guidelines that one can consult in a moment to say, oh, this is the time to offer this interpretation. There are hierarchies that I work through in my mind about if it's a particularly important emotion the person is experiencing, I'm more likely to say something right now. If it's a memory they're reproducing, I might wait and see where that memory takes us because I can get back to the memory by reminding them. I may not be able to get back to the emotion I saw cross their eyes in a moment.
Obrigado, Mark. Me faz lembrar supervisión con Robert Lang el siglo pasado, en donde hacíamos este ejercicio y agradezco sus comentarios para essa prática. Obrigado.
Grande abraço, Sven.
Yes, it's very similar to Robert Lang's approach, although I don't quite adhere to as much, interpreting as much meaning into the frame as he does. And it's also very similar to the way Christopher Bolus supervises. He supervises from verbatim transcripts, which includes the analyst's feelings, thoughts, and sensations, as well as what is said.
De novo, obrigado.
You're welcome.
Marta Chagas, Martinha, por favor, querida.
Oi, primeiro, obrigada, Mark, pela palestra, não, muito boa. Eu queria saber, assim, né, sobre a questão do sonho, né, do analista com o paciente. Como isso é introduzido na sessão, isso poderia ser utilizado como uma interpretação. E aí...
I wouldn't tell a patient a dream of mine directly, but I might take a metaphor that I dreamt about. You know, if I dreamed a patient and I were on a journey together, and we were walking down a trail through the wood, and we came to an obstacle, and we climbed over the obstacle. Rather than telling them the dream of saying, oh, I had this dream about us, in which we're walking down a trail and climbing over an obstacle, I would use Jung's phrase, as if. And I would say something like, you know, it strikes me that it's as if we're on a trail together, on a journey together, and we're learning how to climb over obstacles together. So again, this is speaking from I assume the dream is a countertransference. And so I would share from my countertransference rather than about my countertransference. That's how I would use a dream. With somebody who had been in analysis for a long time, and I was confident about their psychic stability, I might consider revealing the dream directly, but that's the only instance that I would do that in.
Tá, obrigada.
Obrigado. Mark, eu vou fazer a última pergunta para a gente fechar e depois continuar de outra maneira.
Okay.
Qual é o alvo da interpretação? O alvo da interpretação é a fantasia ou é a relação do sujeito com a fantasia? Como é que você pensaria essa questão?
Well, the goal is the expansion of consciousness. So whenever we interpret an unconscious pattern explicitly, verbally, we're bringing unconscious material to the conscious mind, just as a dream does each night. And so when we interpret a dream, we're seeking to expand the patient's consciousness about the dream material. And even if the patient's tendency is to respond to it concretely, we're trying to help them move to a symbolic relationship to it. So the interpretation does the same thing as we hope a dream interpretation does, is we hope it expands the patient's awareness of their unconscious processes and then moves them a little bit further. Now, the other thing an interpretation does is it engages defenses. Our defenses help us survive, but they also limit us in the ways that the rigid patterns of defenses interfere with individuation. So the more we confront defenses and interpret them, the more freedom, the potential freedom of movement, expression, and feeling we're developing. So if we say something like, you know, I notice we often talk about your mother, but we never talk about your father. I'm confronting a defense with that simple statement. And then they might say, yeah, we don't, do we? And then they might say, I'm uncomfortable talking about your father. And I might say, yes, I'm aware you're uncomfortable talking about your father simply by his absence from our sessions. I think your father is a lot more threatening of a figure for you to consider your relationship to. And then it might lead on from there. So the whole idea is that we're trying to facilitate individuation ultimately by identifying the obstacles to the expression of the individual personality and increasing behavioral and emotional responses to situations that they have limited responses to now. In the book, I have a picture of a sculpture by Zenos Fridakis that's in Philadelphia called Freedom. And it's a wonderful image that really captures in one sculpture what we attempt to do as an analyst. And in the first frame of the sculpture, the person is almost completely embedded in a wall. In the next frame, the patient or the figure in the sculpture is starting to move their hand out from the wall. In the third frame, there's quite a lot of the body extracted from the wall and only a foot and a hand still encased in the wall. And in the fourth frame, they've broken free from the wall. And I think in one simple image that describes the process of analysis so beautifully. And he talks about it as he was working through in that sculpture his own creative impasse. But that he, in his statement about the sculpture, he speaks about it could apply to any situation. So the artist intuitively grasps the task of analysis, I think, and that one sculpture serves as a wonderful illustration of what we're doing with interpretation, is we're trying to free the patient from their defenses and their rigid ways of thinking about themselves and the world around them, so that they have more choice, more agency in life.
Ok, obrigado. Mark, queria te agradecer pela tua presença. A tua palestra, ela veio cumprir exatamente os objetivos desse grupo chamado Tiaços, que é apresentar para o público junguiano brasileiro novos autores, novos pensadores junguianos, novas ideias. E, sem dúvida alguma, eu acho que o teu trabalho e o teu livro cumprem muito bem essa função. É um tema que a gente não tem intimidade em pensar, é um tema que nos traz muitas indagações, muitos questionamentos. Obrigado pela oportunidade de você compartilhar isso conosco. E eu teria uma última pergunta. O blues é interpretável?
Well, yes, I think we can. All music seeks to express emotion. It connects us to our emotional life and to the rhythm of life. But blues, like samba, is intended to express emotion explicitly, and through the engagement of it, to transform the experience. So as I say in the blues presentation that I give, blues isn't something to be gotten over. It's a recognition that we're going to experience the blues over and over again in life. But by engaging it through the music, we transform the feeling from something that happens to us, something we participate in. And so for me, that's why I think the blues has a parallel to what I do as an analyst. The vehicle that we do it through is different, but the process, I think, is ultimately the same. In analysis, we're not trying to be happy. We're trying to live in harmony with ourselves. And I think the blues tries to do that as well.
Você vai conseguir mostrar um pouquinho disso pra gente agora?
Sure. Let me take just a minute to, I've kind of got to rearrange the office so I can do that.
Daqui a pouco a gente volta. Isa.
You ready?
Não precisa traduzir o blues não, tá?
All right, this is a song called Going Down South by an artist named L Burnside. Going downtown, well, I'm going downtown. Going downtown, well, I'm going downtown. Chilly windows blow. Going with you, well, I'm going with you. Going with you, well, I'm going with you. Don't care where you go. Be my baby, won't you be my baby? Be my baby, won't you be my baby? Do anything you say. Another man, yeah, bad old man. Another man, well, a bad old man. Always hanging around. Don't want you, no, I don't want you. Don't want you, no, I don't want you. Loving another man. Rather be dead, well, I'd rather be dead. Rather be dead, well, I'd rather be dead. 6 feet underground. Going downtown, way back downtown. Going downtown, way back downtown. Chilly wind don't blow. All right, this one written by a guy named Big Joe Williams. It's called Baby, Please Don't Go. Oh, baby, please don't go. Oh, baby, please don't go. Oh, baby, please don't go down to New Orleans. Baby, please don't go. Turn your lamp down low. Turn your lamp down low. Turn your lamp down low, baby, please don't go down to New Orleans. Or I'll be your dog. I'll be your dog. Or I'll be your dog. I'll get you way down here and make you walk alone. Brought me way down here. Brought me way down here. Brought me way down here about the rolling. Treat me like a dog. Let it go down here. Let it go down here. We're down in New Orleans. Baby, please don't go. You know your man done gone. You know your man done gone. You know your man done gone down to the county farm with all the shackles on. Baby, please don't